Hey everybody, and welcome to Views on Vue. I'm Ben Hong, Senior Front-End Engineer at GitLab, and today on our panel we have Ari Clark, UI UX Engineer at Liquid.
Hello.
We also have Fritz from the Vue team.
Howdy, howdy.
And today our special guest is Jack Koppa, who I had the pleasure of working with at Politico. Jack, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey Ben, my name is Jack Koppa, front-end developer at Politico. Came from kind of a web design-y background and have been doing front-end dev for 4 or 5 years now. Love working with Vue and happy to be here.
Awesome.
About 10 months before we started Ruby Rogues, which is the oldest podcast on devchat.tv, I went freelance. And one of the things that I figured out pretty fast is that I had no idea what I was doing. And I made a bunch of mistakes, but I also made a bunch of friends who were doing freelance, and we got together and we started a podcast called the Freelancers Show. And the Freelancers Show has been running about as long as JavaScript Jabber, but we talk every week about all of the things that we were learning and doing in freelancing and giving people advice on how to get their business started so that they could go out and be independent if that's what they wanted. Nowadays, I'm not on the show anymore, but we have terrific people like Reuven Lerner and Eric Dietrich that come on every week and talk to you about how they run their businesses and give other perspectives on things that you can do. So whether it's how to find clients or whether it's how to step in and start doing training or other programs or how to run a business, they have a ton of experience and they talk about all kinds of things that are going to help you pull things together and be successful as a freelancer. So whether you're thinking about moonlighting and trying it out or whether you're going whole hog and quitting your job, you should definitely check out the Freelancers Show. And you can find that at freelancershow.com.
Well, I guess to get things kicked off, so since you've been in the front-end community for about 4 or 5 years now, what was like your first experience with frameworks in general? Like how'd you get into like frameworks and then Vue?
Started, if you can call anything like jQuery a framework, that was, I think, for most of us, the first time that we experienced something on top of JavaScript. But my first kind of software gig was with an Angular project. It was a company that had used AngularJS, and then this was their first Angular 2+ project, which is also a pretty relevant thing for our topic today with TypeScript, because obviously Angular 2 is when they started writing and developing everything in TypeScript for Angular, which was a really good experience, very opinionated, and so got to see some of the good and bad things about frameworks with that. Then kind of after that role, year or two ago, started picking up React, and then sort of because of the Politico job, got interested in Vue. So at this point, over the last year and a half, I'd say 90% Vue and 10% React on personal projects.
So as someone who's had experience working with all 3 frameworks, can you talk a little bit about sort of the good and bad in comparison of the onboarding as you came on Vue in comparison to the other frameworks?
Yeah, the interesting thing about onboarding with Vue was a decent portion of it was with Ben, either through meetup events or things recommended once I started at Politico. The wonderful thing about Vue is how easy it is to test on any given site. And I think that's something, obviously, that's been built in from the framework from the beginning. It's great to be able to add Vue to any given HTML page and then just follow the tutorial from there. Here's how you create your div. Now start doing things to it and iterating over it or adding VFs and things like that. Whereas both Angular and React, at least for me, have really only been approachable from the Create React app and the Angular CLI, where it really only works if you start a project from scratch, which is totally okay. For Angular, they very intentionally have it that way. That's they'll say very opinionated framework. In order for things to work with dependency injection and with TypeScript and with their testing setup, you really need the CLI to scaffold and architect a project, which is great in some ways if you're being brought on and you have any questions about how are things done in this case, because there's really only one source of truth for how to work with that framework, and it's the Angular documentation. React obviously has a huge community that does things in a lot of different ways. But if you're getting started, it's very much like take Create React app and first learn all the things about how React sets up its project and all the different things that go into making React function. All of them have pluses and minuses, but I think obviously the thing that stands out with Vue a lot is you can try it anywhere and learn sort of jumping in at any point. It also works when you jump into a full-size project, primarily because you have some great resources like enterprise boilerplates to work with.
Cool. And you're using like TypeScript, right?
Yeah.
So you get sort of like a little bit of an Angular 2 experience. So can you talk more about like your experience, like deciding to use TypeScript and what it gives you, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of that came from having used it previously on an Angular project and benefiting from all the things that TypeScript made available, which I was really grateful for on that Angular project. And so coming into one of our Vue projects, actually, when I got here, we were setting up a new application at Politico, and it was time to decide sort of some of the scaffolding. When I expressed that I'd be really interested in trying out TypeScript on this project and seeing what benefits or challenges it would provide, obviously there's a much steeper, maybe not learning curve, but a much steeper setup curve than with Angular, where you don't have to think about it. However, the fact that, and this is something that I'd be happy to get into a bit more with Vue and TypeScript, is that the fact that the Vue CLI has TypeScript plugins and the necessary dependencies already set up, that made it manageable, essentially. And so we were able to initialize a project with TypeScript already in place. And then that meant that the difficulties where things needed to be configured or you ran across a part of Vue that doesn't work quite the same when you're using TypeScript, those were gradual instead of all at once. You could just start the project with TypeScript installed and you could write your first component with some basic types with no issues. And so I think that was huge, that the scaffolding and the available plugins ecosystem already allows TypeScript out of the box. So even though it's not as painless as Angular, it certainly is greatly helped by the CLI structure.
And for people not familiar with TypeScript, I'm a little bit curious. What do you find TypeScript solves for you? Like what kind of problems does it solve for you in your applications?
Yeah, I think a common thing as teams get bigger that they run into is either working on a project with multiple developers and trying to figure out intent and how components or portions of the application are interlinked that you are not working on yourself, and or just if the project that you're working on is big enough and current you doesn't always know what you from 2 months ago was thinking. There's a lot of friction in JavaScript where you're trying to guess what any given method, or in the case of Vue, any given prop or any given event that's being emitted, what the intent and shape kind of that thing is. So a really common example that you come across all the time in a Vue application would be maybe a user component that accepts a prop of user, and perhaps the user to that component is being provided by a list somewhere else. And it's really tough sometimes when you're in the user component to know what the shape of user is. Is it user.name, user.name.first, user.name.last, that type of thing? And that usually entails in a JavaScript project clicking between a lot of different files and hoping that those properties never change, that the first time you write it, it's the same as when it eventually ships to production. So the big thing with TypeScript is that you can set information about the types of your variables or your functions. And this is, I guess, bearing the lead a little bit for those who haven't yet worked with TypeScript. It's a static typing system so that you can add information about the shape of a variable or what a function returns or a constant and what properties are available on it, as opposed to just knowing those things in JavaScript and expecting that, yep, when I get this user object, it'll be user.id. And so that type of information where you can keep things consistent between developers, between components, between perhaps mix-ins or Vuex or all the parts of a Vue application. I think a really key part of this is especially when the application is data heavy and you have lots of data models that you're trying to work with and manage, which has sort of become a theme with SPAs as more and more code ends up in the browser. I think that's where TypeScript is really important with these data heavy and model heavy applications.
Yeah, when I'm not working with types, I've personally found myself sort of trying to solve the same problem by either like console.logging user to see like, what kind of stuff is on user, yes, or, just like printing user out to the page so I can just like see that object and take a look.
Yeah.
I just make classes, but that assumes that I consistently use that class anytime I have an instance of that data model, which as it turns out, just yesterday, I discovered I was not always consistent with that. So yeah, I've been thinking more and more about trying to integrate TypeScript, which actually brings me to a good question. Have you worked much with integrating TypeScript in existing projects? And if so, was it awful?
It was not flawless, I will say that. Yeah, for sure. It was not effortless. Here in DC, where Politico is located, we have a Vue DC meetup. One of the workshops that I attempted to lead was on adding TypeScript to an existing project, because that's in Vue, that's a lot, I would say, a much more common difficulty, because starting with TypeScript is super manageable. So any adding, the process of just converting components to, I don't know if you've seen in the documentation, just setting, you just take your script tag and you set lang equals TS. And theoretically, that's all that's required to get started. But you'll quickly run into some difficulties. For example, Viter or TypeScript, when you try to compile, will tell you that it doesn't know the types of the component, because you need to use a certain view.extend method so you can get that type information. And then if you have a really complex application where you're already using the two things that remain problem points for TypeScript and Vue are Vuex and linting, both of those things can become a little bit of an issue. Linting is really manageable to move past. You'll likely at this point just switch over to TS-lint, which has roughly a 1-to-1 correspondence with linting rules. But Vuex is a big thing, because Vue has a lot of, there are lots of things in it which are magic to the developer, where it can parse just our map actions and get actions. You can tell it, this is the part of Vuex that I'm interested in. I'll just give it a string and Vue will know what to do with that. But that's sort of antithetical to the TypeScript approach, which is everything has to be specific, I guess, and intentional and correctly linked. And so for Vuex to work in TypeScript, there's some tomfoolery that goes on there. And I'm happy to get into that, what the various solutions are to that. But I think if your application is complicated enough where you're using Vuex in lots of places and you like the simplicity of Vue JavaScript using Vuex, I think that's honestly, if not a deal breaker, the primary thing to consider.
Yeah. So I mean, in general, it seems like TypeScript just needs more information. Like when you export default, an object, like a plain object, it doesn't know that this is all Vue related stuff. It doesn't have the context for that. So you'd wrap that object in view.extend to say, hey, this is actually a Vue thing. So just so you know, you can apply all your assumptions about Vue stuff to this object.
Yeah, absolutely. Fortunately, Vue has, for the most part, eliminated that problem. In that case, without too much difficulty, the approach they took was provide lots of complicated but very effective type definitions for a view.extends method, which takes in the exact same component object that you normally output in your script tag. So essentially, to get it initially working with a lot of useful type annotations, it's just view.extends, that method, and then your normal component options object. But exactly that with Vuex, it's a little more complex. Yeah.
So does that mean, for example, not that I've ever done this before, but let's say if I was trying to create a created hook and I accidentally spelled it cra-eated.
In there.
which is maybe almost impossible to see that mistake unless you have some kind of tooling to tell you that it's wrong. Would TypeScript tell me created isn't a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. As much as we may want created to be a thing. And
really, maybe it should just be an alias.
Yeah, absolutely. We should hit the most common misspellings as aliases for most of these things, I think. But yes, absolutely. That's a great thing that TypeScript gives us. So at the time that you're writing that code, perhaps in VS Code, perhaps in any other editor where you can make TypeScript work, at the moment that you type created, normally Vue just allows that to go through, because it's basically the onus is on you as a developer in plain JavaScript to know that the things that you're typing out match the expectations of the application, or Vue in this case. But when TypeScript's initialized on your project and you type created, it'll yell at you and it'll say created does not exist on type Vue options or something of that sort. And the great thing is TypeScript error messages continue to get better. So I would bet, maybe I wouldn't bet a ton of money, but I would bet that when you type that, TypeScript will also come back, did you mean created? It can do a lot of really useful things about, hey, idiot, this is me. This is not what you meant to do.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but like I'm often not at 100% when I'm coding. I have like maybe 2 hours in a day, maybe 1 hour, where I'm just like 100% of my brain capacity, super sharp, and the rest of the time it's just like, you know what? I'll give it what I've got. And I think in this particular instance with created, ESLint plugin Vue can also like warn you about that, even without Vue extend. But there are a lot of cases, like we were talking about that user object, where like you have like user.name or like something I've done before or is like user.complete when really the property is user.isComplete.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then I don't realize that mistake until I see the feature not working. But with something like TypeScript, it would tell you right away, yo, user.complete isn't a thing. Like, these are the properties that are available. Pick from one of those.
So in another way, it sounds a little like you get unit testing for free. Like, is that one way of looking at it for those who haven't used it before?
Yeah, and I think you'll immediately get people who are super invested in unit testing to push back on that and say, of course, a layer of testing on that, a layer of testing on top of this is, if not mandatory, important. But
micro unit testing, micro
property testing or something. You do, and I think it's so. Vue, a CLI project is initialized with, in most cases, a linting plugin that does a great job of catching some of the obvious mistakes that one can make. But you get sort of two new build steps kind of for free with TypeScript, two new development workflow steps to try to catch issues. One is while you're developing and while you're typing in your IDE, and so you can immediately see with red underlines, created doesn't exist, user.complete doesn't exist, or you're expecting user.isComplete. For some reason, you're expecting it to return a string, but it's going to return a Boolean, so make sure that the thing you're interacting with here is a Boolean. So you get that while you're typing. But for me, as I sort of dig into on a larger size front end team, how can you leverage DevOpsy type things to improve developer experience or consistency? The other step that you get sort of immediately is a build. During your build or your compilation step, you learn a lot about your application, whether it's working the way you expected it to be working. So when I change on my, let's instead call it a customer object. On my customer object, when I change subscribe to be is subscribed, does that break things? Like on all the places that are expecting their props to be of type customer or expecting to emit customers, were they accessing customer.subscribed, and does it now need to be is subscribed? And so at the time you commit your code and, you know, perhaps it runs through a CI pipeline or you're just building it locally, you can catch a lot of errors before it actually gets to runtime once the code is in the browser. And I think for us, that's been huge. We get very excited about build failures, which is great.
Yeah, there have been times when I've had for user.isComplete, maybe I want to move that to a registration object, like user.registration.isComplete, because like some other devs were complaining, it's like, what does it mean for a user to be complete? Like, what is this talking about?
You complete me.
We have reached enlightenment.
Great.
False to true.
At that point, you can just turn off your application, right? Once user.isComplete, like there's no reason to do anything else.
Right. Yes. Obviously.
They are beyond earthly desire.
Yeah.
No, but if I reorganize things and then I have to remember, okay, like where are all the places where I'm working with something related to user registration, you know, whether it's complete or some other registration info that is now underneath this nested object. And something nice about TypeScript is it'll just like start throwing errors until you've resolved everything, assuming you've been disciplined with your typings everywhere and not gotten too lazy with just like, let's just do any for now.
Oh my God, stop calling me out, Chris.
I'm speaking from personal experience.
Right, yeah, we've all done it.
Well, I think something that would be interesting for, I think, people listening to kind of push on Ari's point a little bit more, Jack. So having been on the team, I know that TypeScript was actually, they were a little bit resistant to the idea when I was sort of there. And so we had tabled it. And so how have things changed as far as the developer reactions and sort of people's thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say an ongoing battle, but I actually don't think it is at this point. So when we initially started, there's certainly, I think, two very legitimate reasons to be hesitant about adopting TypeScript, either on an individual project or at a team or company level. One is what we've already talked about, which is that in Vue specifically, maybe it's a Vue specific reason, but in Vue specifically, there are some things that it makes more frustrating or that add a little bit of overhead. The Vuex example, getting used to the syntax. But the second very legitimate reason is that for whatever amount that TypeScript adds complexity to development, you don't want that to be a barrier to entry to any people on your team committing to your code base. So depending, again, on the size of your team, there's likely multiple projects or repositories or code bases that you may be working across. And so if someone over in project A continues to just use JavaScript while project B is now starting to use TypeScript, you don't want any additional friction for developers from project A to move to project B. So in both of those cases, that was sort of the initial hesitation. The initial one was a directory project. And as we've done that, it's been 7 months of TypeScript now, I guess, 8. The reaction has been really positive. The people who worked on that project quickly, the learning curve, there's 2 parts. There's the setup, getting over the Vue hurdles, and then there's the learning curve for individual developers. Both of them have been quite manageable, and especially the developers who worked primarily on that directory project, I fell in love with is probably going too far, but certainly would say that they'd much rather not use JavaScript on a project going forward. And then the thing that sort of pushed us over the hump is that we were able to take, Ari, an existing project, which for us was sort of a separate conversation, but our shared component library, we were able to, which started around the same time, but in JavaScript Vue components, we were able to allow TypeScript on that. And it was not a super easy process. And we also had the benefit of it's shared components, so there is no Vuex to deal with. But to get that in place and then to be able to use types in the shared component library and then optionally use those same types in the consuming projects that are using TypeScript, there was just a lot of opportunity there to get all developers at least exposed to it with the initial things of like, how do I add? The most basic part of TypeScript is how and when do you add a colon after a variable and then tell TypeScript what the type of this is. Getting used to that sort of thing has really reduced friction when those same developers come in and work on projects that are fully in TypeScript. And so at this point, I expect that all of our new projects are going to be in TypeScript. That's been the case at least for one most recent project, and that we'll continue to keep an eye on the cases where we can sort of retroactively add it in specific cases, but with the knowledge that there are certainly some places where it's just not going to be worth it.
So when you guys were implementing TypeScript in your component library, was that a sort of incremental change, or was it a, hey, let's just do this overhaul all at once?
Fortunately, it can be a gradual thing. So the all at once part has to be to make sure that any compilation or testing steps that you build on top of the Vue CLI, that those have to still work with your TypeScript components. But because of how Vue decided to approach this, where you can just set lang equals TS on an individual component, we're able to make that an optional thing. So we have 25 shared components, I think, and only 4 of them are in TypeScript right now because those are the only ones who have needed it. So in that way, you get a decent amount of flexibility. So the hassle is in any additional setup that's required for your build or CI or testing tooling. But once you get over that, we have full flexibility at this point to gradually change over any components that would benefit from TypeScript annotations.
Awesome. See, now I'm feeling hopeful about this.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open source Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at sentry.io.
One other potential downside, though, not to dash your hopes, but but something that like a problem that I've experienced in TypeScript sometimes is that like anything you spend time on comes at an opportunity cost of something else, and especially when developers are not coming from a strongly typed language and they want to create really, really dynamic interfaces in JavaScript that sometimes TypeScript doesn't like so much. And then users end up or developers end up spending a lot of time making TypeScript happy. And that time comes at the cost of something else. And, one of the things that can come at the cost of is unit tests. And at least in my experience, like the vast majority of bugs that I see aren't as a result of typing errors, but rather the result of things that like unit tests can catch and are ideally suited to catch. And so when it leads to fewer unit tests or fewer end-to-end tests, like that makes me a little bit worried when people feel like they have a false sense of security because they worry that they think the types are going to save them from everything, when really it's a really a small subset of bugs that the types are saving them from. And again, only if they're disciplined.
I mean, Chris, you assume that I write unit tests or end-to-end tests already.
I guess no. That's a good point, though. That's a good point, though. No, I mean, for people who aren't writing unit tests or end-to-end tests yet, I'd say like invest time in that before you go into TypeScript. And I'd be curious to hear what other people's thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that's very compelling. I think my initial response is that I would agree in most cases, or maybe even all cases, that there are a lot of bugs that you can catch with unit tests that wouldn't be caught purely with TypeScript. But that I think in at least a certain subset of applications where it's data heavy, where there's lots of data being passed back and forth between lots of different components, I think that, I guess my argument is that the benefit and potentially time savings that you get from having TypeScript in place where you don't have to be flipping between files. And I think one of the really compelling arguments for TypeScript is you have this deeply nested object. You have your customer dot registration or user dot registration dot first or whatever dot is complete. Those types of things where you're constantly trying to guess and find, the fact that IDEs and VS Code in particular will auto-complete those things and tell you what's available and sort of guide you along the way. I think in a data-heavy application where you're often doing those types of manipulations, I think the time savings from having TypeScript in place often offsets some of the make TypeScript happy work, though I would definitely not contest that. Given the choice between the two, often it'd be better or more useful to spend the initial time on.
Yeah, although at least in VS Code, which uses some TypeScript tooling to automatically give you some extra IntelliSense, even if you're not using TypeScript. If you're using like classes or prototypes, and especially in combination with Viter, like you'll already get actually a lot of that type information without even using TypeScript. Because you've told it very explicitly, I'm using this kind of thing, and it knows what kind of properties that thing has.
So I guess like specifically the use case that I have been looking at recently is sort of the integration layer between our API and the front end. And it's not uncommon for there to be breaking changes to our data models. So I was sort of looking into ways to dynamically pull in types from an open API spec. But really, the only useful way to do that would be with TypeScript. And so, because like JavaScript's gonna be like, I don't really care what any of this is. It's just a name. But yeah, so for me, and like because we have had a lot of uncaught bugs due to that type of thing, sorry. To me, it's sort of a separate issue from writing unit tests, which I'm not as disciplined about that as I should be. But there are certain times where I feel that unit testing is more important than others, depending on the type of thing that's being tested. And when I'm like, oh man,
that's absolutely true.
Really mess myself up by not doing a unit test, I will take the time and I will write it, even though like I'm just like, the whole time.
If there's a moment, if I can get on my soapbox about that exact thing that Ari brought up, the single big biggest benefit to TypeScript in our 2 or 3 projects now using it has been exactly Ari's use case, which is finding a way to keep things consistent between the front end and back end when you know that there are significant benefits to keeping them separate. Obviously, like all the things that make an SPA an SPA. But how do you keep them consistent when you've already done the work in one place of generating data models and knowing the types that are available? Ari, out of curiosity, is your backend, not that it really matters, but what language is it written in?
Java. So strongly typed.
Got it. So, yeah. So we have the exact same thing, and in our case, it's a Spring Boot backend that you can attach. Yeah, nice. Okay. I think, hopefully, this could be very useful. But any backend that attaches annotations to generate an open API spec, that means that there's this beautiful JSON file that describes exactly what each endpoint accepts and what it returns. Then there are projects built on top of that to generate clients for consuming that API. So whereas we'd typically, in a Vue project, maybe we'd use Axios, we'd do axios.get, and then we'd type out the URL, and then maybe we'd add request parameters, and then we'd get the response, and then we'd guess what properties are available on the response. What has been huge for us is that you can generate a TypeScript API client. So when we have a search API, and so I'll run the command to generate the HTTP client for that search API, or for our user API, or for our directory API. So we'll generate those, and then when it's come time to perform a search, I'll just do search API dot, and then with IntelliSense, see what methods are available on it. One is search members or something, search members of Congress in Politico's case. So search members, and then it'll tell me exactly the shape of the search request that it needs because it has that type information from Java. And then I can, await that, and at the time that I'm using the response, it'll tell me, okay, for a member, you have member dot, and you have photo, you have link, you have first name, last name, that type of thing. And all of that is maintained just with an npm command to run, get latest TypeScript client. And the fact that we can run that at any time, get the latest code, and then see, did our build break? Did the things that we were expecting to be there, are they no longer there? Or is there something new, very importantly, as you're trying to coordinate work with your backend, and they've added the member.photo URL because now there are photos available? You can see that, yep, now in our QA environment, this is available, so I can start accessing the photo. That's been huge. It's probably but I've been emphasizing data-heavy applications. It's probably been the single biggest benefit for us on our TypeScript code bases. And for anything, the nice thing is that you can do a very similar thing with GraphQL, which is also typed for the most part, and that you have a validation spec. So for any either OpenAPI or Swagger API, which is the same thing, or a GraphQL API, you can find a way to generate these TypeScript clients, which has been huge and super time saving for us.
All of that sounded so amazing.
I honestly can't recommend it enough. And I'm sure, there's a spot to link to things. I'll point out some of the best resources for working with that.
Yes, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I like that workflow a lot as well. And even when you're not using a strongly typed language in the back end, if you have a database schema, which probably has types in it, then you still have the ability to parse that file and then generate models and interfaces for TypeScript. That can be you could even put those in separate files. So you could have all of your models and interfaces that are anywhere in your application available for the front end, and then just import the ones that you actually need, import the ones that you actually use. And so that way it can be part of your source code automatically generated whenever the backend adds a new type of thing, and it's just always available. The front end people don't even have to worry about generating those.
Yeah. Actually, at the previous place, so the previous, that Angular project I worked on, it should have been that good in that they were using, so their backend was C# and front end was TypeScript. So those are actually those two languages had the same creator essentially over at Microsoft.
Yeah. I'd say that's a very good marriage.
Yeah. It should have just worked perfectly. And instead we were maintaining two separate sets of models because we hadn't yet had that in place. And so much regret in that case. And I'm really hopeful that they found a way to address that issue. But the the tools that exist for generating from either an open API spec or a database schema or anything like that, yeah, it works fantastically.
Yeah, and sometimes the database schema isn't enough. Like sometimes there are, essentially computed properties, speaking in Vue's language, that are added to the model that are not specific to the database. Like you might have a full name that adds like first name and last name together, which are separate properties. So there's still some extra work that you have to do on top of that sometimes, but it saves so much work once you set it up. And it gives you one single place to update whenever you need things to update.
Yeah, absolutely. That single source of truth, I think, is huge for an application. That's where you're trying to figure out who's responsible for this information about our application.
I'm suddenly starting to feel extremely grateful for some of the choices I made when setting up our API interactions, because I set it up like as an API on the front end. So it's just like liquid API.
Oh, yeah.
Dot, and then the endpoints. So
oh, yeah.
I feel like this is a lot less painful than I thought.
Yeah. The huge thing there is that you can just replace those parts of your application. Yeah, absolutely.
I am so happy with myself right now.
This sounds like a blog post where you just get to congratulate yourself after this.
And I love doing that. So
that's so nice when that happens, when you can think back and think like, I was really smart, rather than the times when you think back a few months ago, like, who wrote this code? They should be fine. Oh, that was me.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I've literally never had that. I've only been angry at past Jack.
This is a new feeling. I'm going to savor it.
So Jack, do you have any questions for like the panelists?
I think from what we've discussed here of kind of the problems that TypeScript can solve or help address, and especially since, I think TypeScript is a popular enough topic in the front end community that I'm sure all three of you have spent a decent portion of time thinking about it. When to you does it feel worthwhile, and have you spent any time either on projects you work on or on personal projects making use of that, I guess? So maybe two separate questions.
So I guess I'll go first. So I'm a consultant, so I work with like a lot of different teams rather than on a single product. And I always have the team that I'm working with decide. I try to lay out like exactly what we've been talking about, like these different pros and cons, and depending on their background, like if they're coming from a C# or Java background, they're going to be a lot more comfortable with TypeScript. And they're already going to be writing code that will be very similar to TypeScript code than if they're coming from like Ruby or Python or something like that, or even JavaScript on the back end. And so I try to lay out all the pros and cons and then let them decide, because I ultimately believe like teams have to have ownership of their tooling. And I could feel really bad about TypeScript simply for the fact that like I didn't choose it and I felt like it was forced upon me. And I'm like looking for things to pick on. And, then I get into like a grass is always greener scenario, or vice versa. If I don't do TypeScript and I'm thinking like, this would have been so much better with TypeScript.
Literally my life right now.
So I think either way is good. I think large enterprise applications can and certainly are built without TypeScript, and they can be built with TypeScript too. And I've never, ever in my life seen a perfect application where their use of TypeScript is like absolutely flawless. Like they're using it for, in exactly the right ways, and they're never fighting against it. And TypeScript is never like getting in the way of anything. And I've never seen a case where like everyone's, doing unit tests and end-to-end tests, like perfectly 100% coverage. Oh, they've never had a bug. The new person comes in the team, a new developer, and 2 years in, she doesn't even know like what a bug means. Never had a situation like that where there's some kind of utopia. So everything is compromises, and you're going to be able to ship either way, and just try your best and try to make the decisions that are best for you.
I think I'm going to piggyback off of that. So as some listeners may know, if they've been listening to the last few episodes, I had the chance to do a complete rewrite of the app that I work on a daily basis. And one of the questions that we discussed at the start was, do we want to use TypeScript? I regret the decision that we made now, but there were reasons. Part of the reason was speed of development, because as has been mentioned several times, it can add some overhead. And also, we didn't really want to fight against setup, to be honest. And like I had read some iffy things about Vue's integration with TypeScript. Mind you, this was over a year ago, so I think things have improved greatly in that time.
But it still could be a lot better.
Okay. Yeah, see? So that was a huge part of why we didn't go that route. But being a data-heavy application, there are so many times where I'm like, God, I wish I had the type safety. Because I'm like, I realize that I'm passing this thing around everywhere, and I have no way of guaranteeing that it still looks the same everywhere. And, as much as I try to do that, like I said, just yesterday I discovered that I wasn't actually invoking the class in one scenario, and it caused a bug. So my personal experience with TypeScript was I've only used it on one project. It was my capstone project at my coding bootcamp. I would say that in that scenario, was it hugely beneficial? No, but it allowed me to understand why TypeScript could be beneficial. But so I'd say like small projects, I don't really see a huge advantage to it. But yeah, once you start to get into more data heavy enterprise type things, I wish every day that I had it.
Yeah, and for me, so one of the things that made me really sad when I left Politico was Jack came on with all this TypeScript experience, which is what we really needed at Politico. Because again, I had tried to sort of mention it and bring it up, but without the background to actually push it forward and make it happen, it was difficult. So Jack coming on was so perfect. And unfortunately, I left before Jack could really get the engine going, and I could really get my hands on some TypeScript. So for me, actually, I've still yet to do a lot of like practical application work with TypeScript. I've done a couple of tutorials here and there, but absolutely eyeing it as far as like, obviously, I think most people have heard, but like Vue 3.0, like the core libraries being rewritten with TypeScript. So for me, it's like knowing that and wanting to be able to contribute to that is certainly part of my motivation for wanting to do more with TypeScript. Similar to Ari's point earlier, I think for personal projects, I think I haven't had the motivation to learn it yet because I probably wouldn't benefit as much when it's like really quick prototypes or just get out something really quick. But I think the moment it starts to be on the team level and you start to do that open source bit, like the project I'm currently working on at GitLab, entirely open source, but eventually I think we do need to go that TypeScript route to help ensure that it's more stable because it is an open source framework. So definitely Jack's evangelizing and all those good things I've heard have made me definitely consider it in the future for the projects that I work on with larger teams.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a good point. If you're just building like a prototype or something to maybe test product market fit, yeah, that might not be the best place for TypeScript. When speed of development is really top. In that case, realistically, you're probably not going to have a lot of tests either.
I tried so hard to do it. It just, as the deadline approached, unit tests just fell by the wayside.
I've never heard that before in my life.
Right? I know. No one ever does that.
Yeah. When you have like a legacy application that, let's say, you're converting over to Vue and you're rewriting a lot of stuff anyway, that could be a good opportunity to introduce TypeScript. And especially like this is a huge application. Maybe you have thousands even models that you have to keep track of. Like realistically, no one in the team has it all in their head. Like even if they've been there for 10 years. And so you just have to like rely on the tooling a little bit more and let it help you. And like the application is so sprawling that like you need to be reminded of like all the places where, that might be affected by a change, or else you become too afraid to touch anything. I mean, how many people have been in applications like that where like there are some parts of the application that you just don't want to touch because you don't know what would happen?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
I had one, this is a little bit of an aside, but related kind of to the Vue implementation of TypeScript, and just something for people hearing this. And if I doubt the reaction is, this sounds great, but I need even more type safety in my application. But for those people thinking that, one thing that's been cool to see from a framework implementation perspective is obviously Vue has the great setup of a single file component where HTML is separate from the JavaScript or TypeScript in this case. And the tooling around that has gotten really, really good. And so Viter, the interactions that we can start to see between what exists in your script component and what is made available to you or recommended to you in your template, where you can start typing, and that's just works equally well in a TypeScript or a JavaScript scenario. But for people who want to see like what would happen if I could like somehow TypeScript literally everything, the answer is what React has done with TSX. So when you're writing your template it started with JSX, obviously. When you write your template in JavaScript, that means that when you write your template in TypeScript, and this, JSX, the weird blend that it is of JavaScript and HTML, it does mean that you get type safety when you're setting props or handling events in React. And so I think a useful thing to do is see kind of how other applications or tools are approaching this. And that was a really interesting thing to see. It was from a shared components perspective, but Shopify, their shared component library does this super well, where you can just clone that and take a look at it. And you can see that when you start typing, like, you have your customer component and you start typing, you start typing ID, you can see that auto-populated, even though it's within a template type thing. So I think that's something to perhaps keep in mind for huge teams, maybe, is that like when you really want everything typed, which is usually not the solution, but you can get this type safety on props and events and within your component or template architecture. I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And that kind of leads into, I think, my last question for Chris specifically is, we know that Vue's being rewritten, or that the Vue 3.0 is in TypeScript. And I was wondering what your impression is. Obviously, there's the function API, RFC, and everything that goes into that. But have you seen, I guess, kind of what has the focus been from a TypeScript perspective? Is it just to attempt to make the development more maintainable, or to also give some benefits to people who are working with TypeScript in Vue from a Politico or a Liquid or a GitLab perspective?
Yeah, I understand. So really, Vue itself being written in TypeScript is really for us rather than for you. It just means we don't have to separately maintain type definitions. It actually has no effect on users whatsoever. And if we didn't make any API changes, like, it wouldn't make the TypeScript experience any better. But yeah, with the functions API in particular, we are working on APIs that will make it much easier to work with TypeScript and make you have to do like less work to like find a compromise between, Vue and TypeScript, and, really like wonderful dynamic code that is possible in JavaScript, and also the strictness of TypeScript. And Vue 3 will be the first time that I'll be like truly happy with the way that like TypeScript is supported in Vue. Like right now, like we've done a lot, and it's certainly manageable. Like a lot of companies use TypeScript very happily with Vue, but with Vue 3 and the next version of Vuex in particular, that experience will get much better, to the point where, like, my hope, and it seems like it, at least in many ways, there really won't be much difference between the kind of TypeScript support we offer and the kind of TypeScript support like Angular offers. It'll feel that natural. It will not be required. Unlike Angular, it will not be required. You do not have to use it. I will not be using it on every application. I would be upset if I had to use it on every application. And it will not feel like you're doing things wrong when you're not using TypeScript. That will not be the case at all.
So you're saying I should wait for Vue 3 until
get out of here.
The endeavor of creating TypeScript.
Oh, I don't think you need to wait for Vue 3, but
Would it be in my best interest, though?
I mean, I assume you have bugs now.
No, never.
Ari's one of those part of the bugs kind of person.
But you know what? You could do like a partial migration, like Jack was talking about.
Yeah.
Where you can start migrating some things to TypeScript. We are going to get the most benefit. Like, I know we've had bugs that could have been caught by typing here.
Yeah.
And so we can add some typings here, and for the rest, we won't worry about it for now.
That seems reasonable, I guess.
I would say even, I haven't attempted to take this approach, but even thinking to yourself, just every file, because it sounds like you have your API files, which are responsible for the API. Every file that's just .js instead of .vue, like that can certainly be a .ts file. If you turn off the no implicit anything and like you just switch those file extensions. Obviously, you need to make sure Vue's set up to compile that correctly, but that's certainly an option. Components can.
I sort of thought might be the best starting point.
Yeah, and
I mean, I felt like that would be
with
less
the bracket.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the bracketing of, I guess, Vuex files are also .js, so maybe a moment of thought about those. But it's really it's in the components where that starts to become an issue. Yeah.
Okay. Should we start wrapping up? What do people think? Any final questions for Jack?
Yeah, I'm good on questions on my end.
I'm good for now. I may be pinging you later, though, Jack.
Very fair.
So, speaking of pinging you, where can people find you on the internet?
On the interwebs, I can be found on Twitter at Jack P. Koppa. GitHub is Jack Koppa. My site just jackkoppa.com. And I like to, Twitter and GitHub-wise, just kind of focus a big portion of the things that I'm focused on right now that happen to be TypeScript and Vue, and I guess on the side, shared components related. So very happy to talk about that. And I have an account on the Vue Discord as well.
This episode is sponsored by GitLab Commit. GitLab's inaugural user event brings together the GitLab community to connect, learn, and inspire. Speakers will showcase the power of DevOps in action through strategy and technology decisions, lessons learned, behind-the-scenes looks at the development lifecycle, and more. Learn how to innovate the future of software development by registering today. GitLab Commit Brooklyn, September 17th, and GitLab Commit London, October 9th. You can find it at devchat.tv/GitLab Commit.
All right, let's do picks then. Let's start with Ari. Ari, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can do that. I have one pick this week. It is a podcast called Soft Skills Engineering. It's actually hosted by two previous panelists from JavaScript Jabber, if anyone also listens to that. It's essentially, they answer non-technical questions about technical fields. So it's sort of like advice for dealing with workplace related tensions generally. I love it because they give good answers eventually, but they like to start with like all of the most ridiculous answers. It's so entertaining, but also informative. So if you want to listen to something tech adjacent, but also just plain entertaining, I highly recommend Soft Skills Engineering.
Awesome. I'll be adding that to my list. Chris, what picks you have for us this week?
All right. I have 2 picks, or 3, depending on how you count them. The first one is a blog post. I actually don't do a lot of tech stuff in my picks usually, but this one is an article about Vue. In Vue, when do I actually need the key attribute and why? This is an article that Marina Mosti wrote that is just freaking fantastic. It's the best explanation I've seen so far, I think, of like when you actually need the key attribute in Vue. And also a very entertaining read. So definitely recommend that if you have any kind of confusion about that. And my second pick is Beat Saber, which I've talked about before. I'm pretty sure that's been a pick before. It's a game where you're basically hitting boxes with lightsabers to the rhythm of a song. So it's like the most awesome Jedi training. It's like combine DDR with like actual Jedi training. That's exactly as cool as it sounds.
I think at the NVIDIA booth at Supercompute a couple years ago, they were having competitions with that. And it looked really entertaining, but I was too scared to try.
Oh, it's so good. I've gotten pretty good at this point. I play on like Expert Plus.
Oh, okay.
I'm not a brag or anything, but like I'm pretty good.
I think we need to do some live streaming.
Yes.
People have asked for that. I don't think it would be as entertaining as people think it would, though.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It would be really
like, it's just like me dancing poorly while hitting things you can't see.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about that is not entertaining?
Yeah, the thing you just described is perfect.
Yeah, I guess when you say it like that, yeah. I wasn't thinking about people like laughing at me rather than with me.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But another resource with that is Beat Saber. I consider this an essential resource. It has like a guide for modding the game and also allowing you to download custom songs that other people create. So like, if there's like a Taylor Swift song that isn't in the game that you really want to shake it off to, then you can have fun with that. And by the way, Shake It Off is a really good track. You should check it out on beatsaver.com. BEATSAVER rather than Saver, rather than Saber. And those are my picks for today.
Awesome. Jack, do you have any picks for us this week?
Yeah, I'll do one tech, one not. Sort of related to Chris's mention of the blog post on the key attribute. Dan Abramov's, his overreacted blog actually ends up being surprisingly applicable to understanding frameworks in general and Vue in particular. So the one that stands out is React as a UI runtime. It's from a little while ago, but I wasn't on the show a little while ago. So throwing that in there. Long read, but super useful for understanding some of the things behind a framework. And then non-tech, Kim Stanley Robinson is a sci-fi author that I like a lot. And the one that I read most recently that stands out a bit is called Aurora. He does kind of like hard sci-fi, so things that are believable, but with cool societal implications stuff. So yeah, Kim Stanley Robinson as an author.
Ooh, I haven't read any Kim Stanley Robinson. Would you compare him to anyone else?
Yes. So a little bit like Asimov was Foundation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a little bit some of the like societal implications from the Foundation series, but Asimov is obviously not like a hard sci-fi kind of thing. So like it's interesting for that reason, but with like technology that you could imagine.
So it's more about the technology than having like a whole chapter that's just about how like women should stay in the kitchen and they'd be happier.
Yes,
Wow.
I think it stays away from that. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Choice.
That's something that I swear, like any book, like any sci-fi book written before 1970 by a man.
Yeah.
It seems like they all have one chapter that is just outrageously sexist. At least one. It makes it so hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Heinlein is guilty of this too in all his books.
Yeah. It's tough to move past those parts.
Yeah,
fortunately, these are written post 1990, so at least
that's good.
Very slightly more enlightened.
Note to self: do not read pre-1970 science fiction written by a man.
I mean, you just have to keep it in mind that you're probably going to see that.
Yeah, I think I'll just avoid it because I don't enjoy being enraged, but it happens.
How do you exist online?
You know what? Some classic science fiction that you can read without feeling guilty about it. Octavia Butler. Read all.
I have read some of her short stories, and yes, she is great.
All right. As far as my picks for this week, just got back from Comic-Con and highly recommend it to anyone who is not afraid of crowds. Like there are over 100,000 people in attendance. So if crowds are not your thing, don't go to Comic-Con. But otherwise, it was a blast. There's definitely something for everyone. Got to attend the Supernatural panel for the last series. So it was a lot of fun. I got two more picks. I'm really late to the game on this one, but I discovered Stardew Valley, which
yes,
you like farm and you sell crops, and it's really cathartic. So
this is why you haven't been responding to my messages.
Look, I had some green slimes to kill. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, listen. I had Stardew Valley in my life for a time too, and now I am not allowed to play it.
Yeah, it was really great for when you're waiting in the long Comic-Con lines and just, you just plant your radishes and, realize the store's closed on Wednesday. So you're like, God.
It is so peaceful. By the way, for anyone who is addicted to Stardew Valley and would like something similar to that, I have not played this, but I've heard that I would love it if I love Stardew Valley. Slime Rancher.
I have not heard of that one.
Real game, Slime Rancher. I think it's on Steam, probably in other places too. But I've heard it is a cure for depression.
Wow. Wow.
Okay.
That's what a lot of the reviews say. I have not played it, and I'm doing okay right now. So save it when I'm more depressed, but
That is good to know. My final and last pick is a book that's been on the top chart recently, and it's called Educated, which is like this autobiography of this woman who grew up in a town where like her family never sent her to school. And it's just like this crazy story that honestly could have been fiction, but it's her real life. And so if you're looking for just like a good nonfiction read, check out Educated. And with that, does anyone have any final thoughts or questions?
let's wrap it up.
All right. And that's it for this episode of Views on Vue. Thanks for joining us. And until next week, enjoy the view.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.